On the second crop, we will be cutting much younger trees. So the volume in the second rotation will be less per acre than from the old stockpile. That old stockpile was a bonus, a gift from nature, but we won't have it the next time around.
In a general sense, and especially in the larger population areas, you get an uneasy feeling that people don't know where our bread and butter comes from.
Intensive forestry can lessen the consequences of the fall-down effect. It can increase our yields to make up some of the projected fall-downs we see coming in the future.
We produce 70% of Canada's lumber. We produce 90% of Canada's plywood. And I like to word it that the Arabs may have oil, we have trees, and long after the Arabs have dug their last drop of oil, we're still going to have trees.
I'm Mike Halloran. BC is one of Canada's richest provinces, one of the richest societies the world has ever known. This affluence was made possible and is maintained by our natural resources, the only source of new wealth that we have. We can regulate the rate at which we use these resources, but we cannot continuously increase their supply. Our problem is that the supply of our natural resources is declining, but the public demands are not. A province-wide analysis has just revealed that a serious shortfall in wood supply is inevitable.
It is only about 100 years since the first extraction of our natural resources began. We trapped fur, we searched for gold, and we began to find ways to utilize the abundant forest resources that had been stockpiling here for centuries. Our first logging operations happened close to the towns, on flat ground, close to the water, on which the timber could be floated to mills and markets. BC's first Forest Act was passed in 1912, but in the early days, the main role of the Forest Service was to protect the forest from fire and encourage industry to harvest wood, thus expanding the province's economic base. In the early days, our forests were not managed, they were merely logged. In the days between the first Forest Act and the present legislation, the BC forest industry underwent a period of enormous change. The obstacles of moving giant volumes of wood over long distances, over rough terrain, of logging steep mountain slopes, these many difficulties were overcome by advances in technology applied through the practical inventiveness of the BC logger. This inventiveness actually had the effect of enlarging the usable forest inventory, because our new technology made it possible for us to log vast quantities of wood that could not have been logged before. We found ways to use smaller wood, older wood, wood of more marginal quality, and wood that was further away.
By the 1950s, better utilization of the forest resource had increased forest activity tremendously. In fact, in the 20-year period between 1950 and 1970, forest harvesting in British Columbia increased by more than 300%. These decades of continuous expansion created new mills, thousands of new jobs, even new towns, and raised the economic expectations of a whole generation of citizens. But this period of expansion also created some problems as well. For during the same period, the non-forestry community, agriculture, hydro, fisheries, and grazing, was vastly increasing its expectations as well. It was inevitable that some conflicts would emerge.
As expansion of forest harvesting occurred, we also engaged in the expansion of the range cattle industry, whose very nature depended more heavily on grassland than forest land. We learned that forest succession, the gradual takeover of grassland by encroaching forests, was reducing the extent of ranges at the very time when the cattle industry wanted to expand. This event was aggravated by the consequences of historic overgrazing of much crown rangeland, a fact which continues to trouble us today.
By the mid to late 60s, the forest manager, along with the managers of all other resources, was confronted with increased public concerns for ecological values, for clean water, clean air, fish and wildlife, as well as parks and wilderness. The fierce competition caused by this ecological awakening took place at the same time that the industrial, social, and economic demands of the community were also rising dramatically. All of these demands had to be satisfied from the same land base.
During this period of time, we constructed huge power dams on many of our major river systems. These dams provided us with electric power, but they also covered some of the most productive growing sites in the province. In addition, they drowned the habitat of wildlife and reduced the land available for agriculture, human settlement, and other purposes, thus increasing the competition for the remaining land. BC is more than just trees. Forests provide benefits beyond logging. The citizens of BC are the owners of a highly valuable salmon resource. The spawning habitat of these creatures is tied vitally to the water quality of forested streams. Unless these values are considered in the logging process, there will be large and negative impacts on fish habitat and water quality.
Land use or resource use demands can impact on wood supply in two ways. One way is where it physically involves a land withdrawal, such as forest land that has been considered in the forest land base being used for other uses, such as agriculture development, urban encroachment, power lines, highways, hydro developments, parks, and so forth. That's understandably so, where the actual forest land base is reduced and therefore the sustained wood supply from the total forest is reduced accordingly. A second way that is impacted is in other resource uses where wildlife objectives are set. A new salmon enhancement program comes into place. It doesn't mean a land withdrawal because we're talking of a forest land base, but it does put prescriptions onto harvesting, constraints onto harvesting, if you would like to call it that way, that does mean that there is some negative impact on the rate of harvest as these are introduced.
One of the most recent and most publicized of these resource conflicts was the forestry fisheries clash at Rennell Sound in the Queen Charlotte Islands. In the early part of 1979, federal fisheries officers arrested several loggers on the steep slopes of Riley Creek after the loggers refused to obey orders to halt the logging operation. Fisheries had previously approved the logging plan for Riley Creek, but after the logging had begun, fears were expressed that removing the trees would cause the topsoil to slide. As the conflict developed, the operation was halted, charges were laid, then dropped. Tempers flared. Those were the human consequences. The effect on the land was more lasting. Tons of soil and debris slid off the side hill of Riley Creek in the fall rainy season of 1979. There are no winners in this kind of conflict. The soil loss is a negative factor to forestry because it is needed to grow another crop of trees. But if some of that soil finds its way to Riley Creek, it will become an obstacle to salmon production. In the aftermath, environmentally sensitive sites are being given special treatment. We learn by doing. This is the way to do it wrong.
Sometimes the factors affecting rates of harvest are quite obvious. Other times they are much less so. When a new park or wilderness area is established, all logging must be foregone and the allowable cut lowered to compensate for the reduced forest acreage available. These cases, while hotly debated, are at least fairly straightforward. Often it is much more complicated than that.
On the Blewett Slope south of Nelson, a stand of high-quality timber was slated for logging. But it was found that springs and streams on this side hill were the source of domestic water for hundreds of families. At first, the citizens took a dim view of plans to log this watershed. But they were given a guarantee that water quality and water quantity would be maintained. Experience gained on the Blewett Slope underscores the need to be flexible in resource planning, the need to design a solution that suits the conditions of the site, to consider demands other than logging, and engage in a dialogue with the public.
Through a lot of dialogue, we've managed to come to some agreements with the people. We have adopted equipment and logging prescriptions which will take into account their resource, protect the water supply, and yet allow recovery of some of the timber values from the area. The initial public reaction was that we would reserve all the timbers for water protection, but that, of course, is equally as unsatisfactory as taking all the timber and abusing the water supply. We're now logging in Blewett. We've been logging there about 2 years now. It's a very small show, but staggered over many years, it's going to recover almost all of the timber values and yet protect the water supply, and also will have the added benefit of enhancing some of the wildlife values in the area. There's been special equipment adapted to log on Blewett. The prescriptions are for a lot of selective logging. There will be some small clear-cut patches. Carefully planned area with a lot of public input to make sure that all resource values are protected.
I have been given the opportunity to work with the Forest Service to develop a public involvement program that looks at the environmental issues and the forest management related issues that exist in each of the forest regions of the province, and to help regional teams develop which are capable of designing public involvement events to make sure that citizens get a chance to speak to the local environmental and forestry issues in the communities in which they live, not just at some central location in the province. I think that the role is enormously important. The citizen is, in the last analysis, the only real steward of the landscape. And if the citizen isn't involved, then only vested interests with a particular axe to grind, if you'll pardon the pun, are going to be dealing with the disposition of resources.
Attempts to satisfy all the demands on a given land area is usually not possible. Sometimes absolute conflicts emerge. Such a situation has arisen with respect to logging versus mountain caribou. Mountain caribou are fascinating animals. These individuals live in the Selkirk Mountains not far from the U.S. border. They were once abundant in many parts of North America, but are now quite rare. Except for a few wanderers from Canada, mountain caribou are now extinct in the lower 48 states. Caribou live in high-elevation spruce balsam forests in the wintertime. Their principal diet is a lichen commonly called old man's beard. They have adapted to depend on this high-protein food source, just as they have adapted to travel in deep snow. They simply follow the lichen up the tree as the snow gets deeper. As attempts were made to maintain wood supply to existing mills, it was found that the habitat requirements of the caribou collided head-on with public demands for wood. The Selkirk herd was obviously threatened, so wood harvest was curtailed in order to protect them.
Right now, I would say that I've got a good feeling about the practice. We've got loggers who are interested, we've got forest companies who are interested. The Forest Service has been very cooperative and very helpful here. So all parties have made a sincere effort to consider caribou along with forest harvesting, and this is a very welcome sort of attitude. All living things are subject to ups and downs as far as their numbers go. Living things don't remain static. And in this case, even our caribou are subjected to ups and downs. I think we must point out that in time, these animals and the plant communities will reestablish themselves.
Many people believe that the term sustained yield means that all renewable resources will show a continuous harvest from the same place at the same time. This is seldom possible. All the government departments charged with managing fish, wildlife, timber, rangeland, and water have client groups they must try and satisfy. The available benefits must be balanced between these groups. To make it even more complicated, renewable resources are all subject to the dynamics of natural growth and decay, and therefore, harvest rates will vary widely in both place and time. Many citizens are poorly informed as to the extent of the BC forest base. Only about 50% of the province even has any trees on it at all. Much of the land area consists of snow, ice, rock, grassland, water, and tundra. Of that part which is forested, some is very unproductive, meaning that a large harvest cannot be maintained because the growth rates are so very slow.
Today, over 20% of our harvest is coming from 3% of our forest land, which is the good site forest land. It is extremely important that British Columbia maintains its best forest land in forests. If we're talking of an intensive forestry program in the future, and it is going to be done on the poorer sites, the more remote sites, the steeper sites, then we can forget it. We will not remain competitive with our competitors. All our competitors are striving to maintain their best forest land, in fact, are making attempts and accomplishing the objective of bringing back into forests many lands that were put to some other use.
I think everyone's familiar with the concept of urban sprawl. Cities like Vancouver spreading out onto the rich agricultural lands of the Fraser Valley. Something that's not so easily understood or not so commonly understood is that agriculture is having a similar effect on the forest land base. In an effort to maintain production of beef, for example, large areas in the interior of the province are being brought into agriculture. And it seems to me, from the little work that I've done, that we could do better if we grew trees there. If you look at the soils of the central and northern parts of the province, they're much better adapted to growing trees than they are to growing grass and beef. And we're taking more land for agriculture. Saw a news item the other day that industrial people want to increase beef production in the province. The only way they can do this is to increase the amount of land allocated to beef production. And that means withdrawing it from forest use.
Our new legislation requires us to look at other resource programs and determine what effect it will have on forestry programs. We did this. We contacted the other agencies, fisheries biologists, wildlife biologists, and the like. We received their assessment of their programs. We did not take everybody's dreams, but we did put together what we felt was a realistic and practical appraisal of the effect of other resources on the forest resource. It resulted in a netting down of the gross land base by some 25%, from some 47 million hectares to 35 million hectares. I feel that this is a significant netting down and has abided by the principles of the Act that we have been required to do.
These varied resource options all contribute to our quality lifestyle in one way or another, but we have also learned, the hard way, that not all land use options can be practiced on the same acre at the same time. Nevertheless, a province that runs on wood cannot afford to run out. Now we must face the ultimate question. What effect will all these factors have on BC's future wood supply?
Up to a century ago, the forests of this province were virtually unexploited. These forests had slowly been building volume for centuries. Accumulated on many forest sites were massive columns of wood, many of them hundreds of years old. The growth rates on these old plants was very slow, but over the centuries they had become a huge volume of wood. In the logging of these old-growth forests, we obtained a great harvest for each acre logged. But our future harvest will be based on much younger and much smaller trees, and the volume per acre logged will be less. There has recently been much speculation about the extent of the BC wood supply. The timber supply analysis recently completed by the Forest Service provides pretty specific information as to what can be expected in the future. There are many regional differences across the province, but the general overall direction is now known. This simple graph gives us an idea of what options are open to us now. As we said earlier in the film, wood harvest rose by more than 300% between 1950 and 1980. The present harvest level is about 75 million cubic meters of wood per year. What will happen to the level of harvest from now on depends pretty much on the level of forest management that we decide to apply. If we do not increase our level of forest management, then future production levels could end up looking something like this. As you can see, on average across the whole province, this drop could be as much as 1/3 of current production. This condition has been given a name. It's called the fall-down effect. We also have another option, one that could virtually eliminate the fall-down effect, provided we don't lose too much more land to other uses. We must reduce forest waste, catch up on reforestation, and get into a long-term program of intensive forestry. These measures will lessen the size of the fall-down effect because they will increase the wood supply.
In British Columbia, we have defined basic forestry and intensive forestry for our legislation and for our tenures. Basic forestry we look at as simply maintaining the productivity of the site and obtaining regeneration. Intensive forestry is those cultural practices that man can develop in the forest to increase its yield both in quality and quantity. This would include spacing, it would include fertilization, it would include commercial thinning, tree improvement or forest genetic programs, and this in place and additive can produce significant increased benefits from the forest both in wood quality and wood quantity over rotation.
No project in the history of British Columbia is as important as the establishment and tending of the new forest that we need on a grand and on an intensive scale. I think it's vital for the future of the province. And without the rapid and successful establishment of these forests and the completion of this project, and the rapid completion of it, BC will certainly face declining timber harvest with consequent loss of exports, large-scale unemployment, and a decline in our living standards. Of course, there'll also be a loss of the largest portion of government revenues, those tax revenues needed by the government to maintain, let alone expand, the social programs which in health and education which we already take for granted.
The net land base is shrinking. If we are to maintain a viable forest industry in this province, which is one of the objectives of our ministry, to maintain a viable forest industry in the province, we must attempt to maintain a continuous wood supply. And as the land base continues to shrink from the variety of demands being put on it, as I outlined earlier, then we must produce more wood from less acres. And this can be done to a practical degree, provided it is done in the best forest land.
People are beginning to recognize that the availability of these renewable resources is not a foregone conclusion, and that it's going to take extremely tight and careful planning And that's really the major issue, is how do you make those things honestly renewable, whereas in the past we thought that they were inexhaustible.
Within their biological limits, renewable resources can provide yield in proportion to the level of management we give them. We can log and raise cows and hunt moose and fish for salmon for just as long as we continue to stay within those limits. But there is no question that the supply of those resource commodities will vary, both up and down, as social, economic, and environmental conditions change.
When I look at the world picture, it makes British Columbia's picture look more promising. But in the world, in spite of all the reforestation that's been done, and all the good stories we hear in Brazil and other places, and all the developing countries, in spite of all the reforestation programs being done, the world is losing its forest land at a rate of over 30 million acres a year.
On a world scale, the UN has estimated the loss of forest land to be 30 million acres a year. Now, if you compute that out, that comes to 50 acres a minute.
Few people realize that 50% of the world's harvest is for firewood. And much of the world that are hungry are also hungry for wood. And this erosion of the land base at this fantastic rate of 30 million acres a year leaves me with some pessimism for the world, even though it leaves me with optimism for British Columbia, because we have trees, and as I said, long after the Arabs have dug their last drop of oil, we're still going to have trees.
The historic accumulations of plenty, the natural stockpile we spoke of earlier, provided great opportunities for economic growth, and there was no reason why we should not have taken advantage of them. That was what we came here to do. The wood was there. We had the technology to move it. The markets were there, and there were people who needed the job. But that historic stockpile is running out. The fall-down effect is coming, and we must invest heavily in forest management in order to stay in business. Everybody wants more. Everybody wants a bigger share. There are demands for more wildlife, more wilderness, more salmon, more rangeland, as well as more wood. The pressures being placed upon all resource management agencies are steadily increasing. The demands on the land base are increasing as well. The sum of these demands is now greater than the land's capacity to meet them. The days of superabundance are gone. The division of resource values must change with the times. The decisions will not satisfy everybody and may end up satisfying no one.